Now, today wasn't about changing the entire practice. It is about changing how you see it. Now, the CEO transition is a deliberate process of removing yourself as the bottleneck without losing trust, quality, or care. It's about redesigning how decisions, ownership, and responsibility flow through the practice so everything doesn't have to pass through you. When chiropractors start moving through this process, they often hit a few speed humps. And if you're not expecting them, it's easy to think that you're doing something wrong. Now, you're not. These are predictable and they're part of the transition from employee mode to CEO mode. If all you take from this episode is a little more awareness, a little more compassion for yourself, and a willingness to create space to think, then that is absolutely enough. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, folks. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Marketing Your Practice podcast, the podcast where I have the pleasure of simplifying the marketing and the mindset so you, the chiropractor, can increase your income, your impact, and your enjoyment in practice too. If you're new here, then welcome. You've joined us in the middle of a short leadership focus series, and today's episode is an important continuation of the conversation that we've been having. In episode number 1, we talked about the shift that most chiropractors never make, and that is moving from employee mode to CEO mode. Not so much in the corporate sense, but in how you see yourself in the practice, from being the one who fixes everything to being the one who designs how things work. Now, in episode number 2, we made that shift much more practical, okay? We talked about the CEO check-in, okay? This is about creating protected thinking time so you're not constantly reacting, fixing, and carrying everything in your head, okay? We explored why feeling like you have no time is actually a leadership problem, okay? And how carving out a small amount of thinking time each week can change the quality of the decisions and therefore your days. Now, today I want to go a layer deeper, because once chiropractors start to slow down and think like a CEO, something else tends to show up, okay? And it's not a system problem, it's not a strategy problem, it's emotional, okay? This episode is about why so many practices end up depending entirely on the chiropractor, and why everything ends up bottlenecking around you, and why letting go feels harder than we expect. So if you've ever felt like the practice can't function properly without you, if stepping away makes you feel uneasy, or if being needed has quietly become part of your identity, this conversation today is for you. Now, before we talk about why this happens, we need to be really clear on what it actually looks like, because most chiropractors don't wake up one day and say, I've designed my practice so everything depends on me. It creeps in quietly, okay? So let me paint the picture, and as you listen, just notice what resonates, okay? Now, you might be the bottleneck if most decisions come back to you, even the small ones, okay? If your team hesitates unless they've checked in with you first, if you feel a low-level anxiety when you're not in the practice, if time away from the practice creates more stress than it does relief, if problems seem to pause when you're present and resurface when you're not, or you might notice it emotionally, okay? A constant sense of being needed, okay? Or the subtle pressure of being available. A feeling that if you don't stay on top of things, then something might slip. Now, none of these make you a bad leader. In fact, it usually means the exact opposite, okay? It means you care. It means you're capable. It means you're reliable. But over time, those strengths can quietly turn into a constraint, okay? Now, here's another way that you can check, okay? Ask yourself this. What breaks or slows down when you're not there, okay? What decisions live only inside of your head? And what do people regularly bring to you that shouldn't require you? Now, if you answer a lot to any of those questions, there's a good chance that you're the bottleneck, okay? And it's not your team. It's the design of your practice that's the problem. Now, the important thing to hear right now is this. Now, this didn't happen because you did something wrong. It happened because of how most chiropractors are trained to lead, okay? And that's what we're going to talk about next. So most chiropractors don't choose to become the bottleneck, okay? It happens gradually. And for a long time, it actually works. In the early days of practice, being involved in everything is necessary, okay? You're building, you're learning, and you're proving to some extent that you can handle it. Decisions live in your head because you're the one with the context, okay? You step in because you can do it faster, and you stay close because that's what feels responsible. And early on, that behavior gets rewarded. Patients trust you, staff rely on you, okay? And things move because of you. But over time, though, the practice grows, but the leadership model doesn't, okay? What started out as involvement quietly turns into dependency, okay? And without meaning to, the practice ends up becoming organized right around you, okay? Not because you necessarily wanted control, but because no one's ever helped you to redesign your role. Now, there's another layer here, and it's one that most of us as chiropractors don't talk about openly, okay? Being needed feels good, okay? It feels validating, it feels important, and it reassures you that you matter. Now, especially in chiropractic, a profession that's built on care and connection, being relied on can feel a little bit like a virtue. When people come to you for answers, it reinforces an identity. I'm the one that holds things together. Now, that's not ego, that's human. And the challenge is that over time, that emotional reward can compete with your desire for freedom. The practice needs you, and part of you needs to be needed. Now, that tension, though, is rarely conscious, but it does shape your behavior. And the result is letting go feels risky, even when you're tired and even when you know that something has to change. Now, it's important to realize wanting to be needed is not a flaw, okay? It doesn't make you weak, and it doesn't disqualify you from being a strong leader. In fact, it's often the very thing that made you successful in the first place, okay? Caring deeply, being dependable, and showing up when it matters. The work here isn't to get rid of that part of you, it's to lead it, okay? But when you acknowledge it with honesty and compassion, it gives you choice. The shift isn't from caring to not caring, okay? It's from being needed for everything to being trusted for what matters most. Now, your value doesn't disappear when you step back, but it does relocate. It moves from answering every question to creating clarity so fewer questions need to be asked, okay? From fixing problems in the moment to designing conditions where fewer problems arise. Now, here's the paradox. When you stop proving your value through availability, your leadership becomes easier to feel for everybody else around you, okay? Now, this is not a loss of identity. It's an expansion of it, okay? Now, there's something that I want you to look out for, because once you start to shift from being needed to being trusted, something important often happens. Now, intellectually, it makes sense. And yet, when it comes time to actually step back, many chiropractors are going to notice resistance, okay? Not because they don't understand what to do next, but because identity moves faster than behavior, okay? That's where the real friction shows up, okay? And it brings us to the next piece. Once dependency and identity become intertwined, letting go stops being a practical problem and it becomes an emotional one, okay? You're not just delegating tasks, okay? You're loosening your grip on certainty, and questions are going to surface, okay? Things like, what if things aren't done properly, okay? What if standards slip? And what if something important gets missed? Those questions really make sense, but underneath them is often a quieter one, okay? And that is, if I'm not needed in the same way, who am I here? Now, that's why so many chiropractors understand the logic of stepping back, but struggle to do it consistently. Now, again, this isn't a flaw, it's just information. It's showing you the next phase of leadership, okay? It's showing you that it's not about effort, that it's about redesign, okay? Now, this is where a lot of really well-intentioned chiropractors get stuck. They see the problem, they feel the pressure, and they decide that it's time to delegate and they want to do it fast, okay? So they pull back abruptly, they hand things off without context, and they tell themselves that they shouldn't be involved anymore, okay? Now, instead of relief, what ends up happening is things get messier, okay? Mistakes increase, frustration builds and trust gets shaky on both sides, okay? Now that's because delegation without redesign doesn't remove the dependency, okay? What it does is it just transfers confusion. When the decisions still live inside your head, when the expectations are implicit, when ownership isn't clear, then stepping back ends up creating anxiety instead of freedom, okay? Now, that's why forcing delegation often feels like failure, not because the delegation is wrong, but because it's happening too late in the process. And this is why the CEO check-in from the last episode matters so much. Now, before you delegate, before you restructure, before you change roles, you need space to see what actually depends on you and why. The CEO check-in isn't about doing less. It's about seeing more clearly, okay? It's where you notice which decisions keep coming back to you, which problems repeat, and which responsibilities never really left your plate. Now, without clarity, every change feels risky, but with it, redesign starts to become obvious, okay? Now, before we walk through the steps, it's important to name what this actually is. This isn't delegation. It isn't stepping back and hoping for the best. And it isn't about doing less because you're tired, okay? This is what I call the CEO transition. Now, the CEO transition is a deliberate process of removing yourself as the bottleneck without losing trust, quality, or care. It's about redesigning how decisions, ownership, and responsibility flow through the practice so everything doesn't have to pass through you. Now, this doesn't happen overnight and it doesn't happen by force, okay? It happens through clarity, through sequence, and it happens through intention. Now, let me slow this down and walk you through what this actually looks like in real life. I'm going to follow a very typical chiropractor, busy, capable, caring, as they move through these steps, okay? Now, step number one is to create space. Now, at first, this feels awkward, okay? They sit down for their CEO check-in and they notice how quickly their mind wants to jump back into the doing. They realize that most of their thinking has been happening inside of the day between patients and under pressure, okay? Now, what to look for here isn't answers. It's the restlessness. It's the urge to rush, okay? That's employee mode. That's loosening its grip. Now, step number two is notice dependency. Over the next few check-ins, patterns are going to start to appear. The same questions are going to keep landing on your desk, okay? The same decisions keep circling back and the same problems are going to feel oddly familiar. This is where many chiropractors realize it's not my team can't decide, it's that I've never truly decided, okay? What to look for in this phase here in phase two is repetition. Repetition is the signal. Now, step number three here is name the decisions. Okay, step number three, name the decisions. Now the chiropractor starts writing things down, not tasks, but decisions. How do we handle things like late cancellations? Who decides when schedules change? What happens when a patient pushes back, okay? This step often brings relief because for the first time, the weight becomes visible, okay? What to look for here is clarity. It feels lighter once it's named and you're on the right track. Now, step four is redesigning ownership, okay? Instead of delegating everything, they choose one area. They clarify, this decision lives here, this role owns it, and this is what good looks like, okay? Now, this isn't abdication, it's leadership, okay? What to look for here is confidence on both sides, okay? There's less checking, there's fewer interruptions. And finally, we make our way through to step number 5, and this is about stepping back intentionally, okay? Finally here, the chiropractor resists the urge to jump back in, not because they don't care, but because the system now holds the decision, okay? They stay available, but they're not entangled, okay? What to look for here is not perfection. It's quiet, it's fewer fires, it's more mental space. And this is how employee mode slowly releases its grip, not through force, but through clarity, sequence, and trust, okay? Now, before we wrap this up, there's something else I want to cover. When chiropractors start moving through this process, they often hit a few speed humps, okay? And if you're not expecting them, it's easy to think that you're doing something wrong. Now, you're not. These are predictable and they're part of the transition from employee mode to CEO mode. Now, speed hump number 1, it feels slower before it feels lighter. When you stop reacting and you start redesigning, things can feel like they've stalled. Decisions that used to happen automatically are now being examined. Okay, now this isn't inefficiency, it's recalibration. Speed hump number 2, your team may feel uncertain at first. When decisions move out of your head and into the open, people can sometimes hesitate, not because they can't handle the responsibility, but because the clarity is new, okay? This is where leadership presence matters more than just control. Speed hump number 3, you're going to feel the urge to jump back in. Old habits don't disappear quietly. When something wobbles, employee mode will tell you just fix it quickly. Now you need to pause here, even briefly. It's often the most important moment of this entire process. Speed hump number 4, not everything is going to improve at once. Removing yourself as the bottleneck doesn't create instant perfection, okay? It creates learning, and some areas are going to stabilize quickly, but others are going to need multiple areas of refinement. Progress here will be uneven, and that is totally normal. And finally, speed hump number 5, your identity may lag behind your behavior, okay? Even as the practice becomes less dependent on you, part of you will still feel responsible for everything, okay? And that gap can feel uncomfortable. It doesn't mean that you're regressing. It just means your identity is catching up with your leadership. Now, none of these speed humps are signs to stop, okay? They're signs that you're actually doing the work. What we're really talking about here isn't delegation, it's transition, okay? It's a shift from being the center of everything to be the designer of how everything works. Think of it, as I mentioned before, as the CEO transition. It's the process of deliberately removing yourself as the bottleneck without losing trust, quality, or care. Now, as we wind this up, I want to slow this right down. If this episode stirred something up for you, if parts of this felt uncomfortably familiar, that's not a problem to fix. Again, that's just information. Now, today wasn't about changing the entire practice, okay? It is about changing how you see it. You've learned how to recognize when you've become the bottleneck, okay? You've seen how this happens gradually, often as a byproduct of care and competence, okay? And you've been introduced to the CEO transition, okay? A way forwards that doesn't require force, okay? It doesn't require pressure or blowing everything up, okay? The most important thing to remember is this: you don't have to do all 5 steps at once. You don't need to fix everything today, and you don't need to have it all figured out. Leadership doesn't move through urgency, but it does move through clarity, okay? If all you take from this episode is a little more awareness, a little more compassion for yourself, and a willingness to create space to think, then that is absolutely enough. In the next episode, we'll take the next natural step. Once you see dependency clearly, okay, the question becomes what actually needs to move out of my head. We'll talk about decisions and ownership and structure and how small shifts can dramatically reduce pressure without losing standards of care. Okay, now that conversation is going to build directly on what we've covered today. So if this episode really resonated, then I want you to join me in the next one. So as always, folks, thanks for all that you do. Keep saving lives, and I look forward to seeing you back here next week. Bye. If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come and check out my Community Influencer Program. It's my monthly coaching program where we take all this material and I'll work with you to help you apply it, implement it, and systemize it. The Community Influencer Group Coaching Program is designed to help you increase your practice income, impact, and enjoyment. Join me over at anguspyke.com/join. That's anguspyke.com/join. I'd love to see you there.